Spud Whiteman here, and this is the second video of my series of what a typical week was like, and for that matter mostly still is for a race team during the season. I'm basing this off the 2008 race in Michigan because I have a pretty comprehensive file for that race. So let's get to it. It's Tuesday morning. Yesterday was all about getting the car set up. Today we rolled the car onto our Petree Rig so we can do all of our pull-down tests. That's going to include our wheel loads, our camber, and our Bumpsteer. I said Petree Rig, as in Andy Petree. If you're a NASCAR fan, you may know Andy as a broadcaster from ESPN, ABC, and Fox over the years. If your knowledge runs a little bit deeper, you probably know that he crew chiefed Harry Gant to 9 Winston Cup wins, as well as won a couple of Cup titles in 93 and 94 with Dale Earnhardt while Andy was at RCR. Actually, he returned to RCR some 6 or 7 years ago to become their vice president of competition. Andy designed and started building these pull-down rigs in the early 2000s. And I have to tell you, you are hard-pressed to get a car set up properly anymore if you don't either own one of his machines or a Miller rig. I'm a little shy on pictures of Phoenix Racing's Petree Rig back in the day, so I'm going to have to rely heavily on pictures and videos that I took a few days ago out at Johnny Davis Motorsports in Gaffney. Well, Case Kallenbach and the rest of the crew on the 6 car was pulling down their Talladega car. I worked at JD's from December 2018 until the end of the season in 2022. Went over to Jeremy Clements Racing for the 2023 season and retired at the end of that. Realized, holy crap, sitting on the couch all the time is really boring, so I'm back. I'm working a couple of days a week at Johnny's, just kind of helping out, doing some computer stuff and some, light fab and whatnot. Anyway, let's get back to Tuesday morning at Phoenix Racing. The guys you would see working on the car while we did the pull-down tests were, of course, Nick Harrison, because he was the crew chief. Jason McDowell would be up there. He was the car chief. Either Tristan Smith or I would run the machine and record the data. Our shock specialist, Herb Englehart, would have to be there. And usually Josh May and Josh Slater would be there helping with any changes we might have to make to the car during the tests. Okay, let's waddle about 16 years forward over to JDM. They've actually got 2 Petree rigs. It was rough trying to get 4 cars, the 01, the 4, the 6, and the 15, set up and pulled down when we only had the 1 rig. We got the 2nd rig, and in 2022, when we dropped back to 2 teams, we'd invariably end up with the 6 car on the left plate and the 4 car on the right, both of them getting set up and pulled down at the same time. I'd be hopping from one car doing, say, a loads test, and then quick hop over to the other and do a test on that one too. Now note that the Petree rig is flush to the floor. The plate itself is 1.5 inches thick, if my memory serves me correctly, and the surface has been milled flat. That means you can use the Petree rig as your setup plate. And when you are done setting up, bam, you are right there ready to pull the car down. I had mentioned the Mittler rig earlier, and I think it would behoove us to note the differences between the Mittler and the Petree rig. So I called up Mark Setzer this morning. He was my crew chief at JDM 2019 and 2020, and has been Jeremy Clements' crew chief since 2021. And he was my crew chief, obviously, last year when I worked for Clements. Anyway, I called him up and asked if I could come over and take a couple of pictures of the rig. As luck would have it, he had his Darlington car on there and still had a couple of tests left to run. So I hopped in the Bad Astrovan and hustled over there. As you can see, the Mittler rig is above ground. If you look carefully at the back of the rig, you'll see the hydraulic cylinders. This allows the back of the rig to pivot down, and then you're able to winch the car up a set of ramps and onto the rig proper, and then level the rig back out. The above ground thing is, it offers some advantages. I'll be mentioning others a little later on, but it gives you a lot of room to get under the car and work on it, if you are trying to change, like a spring or bump slugs or, stuff like that. The downside with it being above ground like that is you ain't setting the car up with it up on the rig. I mean, it's beyond precarious. It's well nigh impossible. And that's why you'll see, teams that have them, like Clements, they've got a separate setup plate. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of the differences between the Petree and the Miller rigs, let's head back over to JD's and commence with getting the car ready to pull down. Okay, so we're done setting up the car. The heights are set. The weight percentages are dialed in. Be they the total weight, front percentage, the cross weight, or wedge if you prefer, and the left side weight as well. We've got a pair of strut rods that have replaced the front shocks and are locking the front heights in right now. They're going to come off the car a bit later once the car is up in the air and tied down to the rig. If you look carefully, you'll see a bar that is attached to the plate a little bit behind the front tire, and it runs up to the bottom of the car a bit in front of the rear tire. The front attaches to a plate directly under the front of the lead rail, and the rear attaches at the rear end of the lead rail. This keeps the car from being able to roll off the scale pads once the car is raised. We're now going to raise all 4 scale pads 6 inches off the floor. This is going to be our new zero height for the scale pads during the rest of the test. If you're wondering what that welder is doing there, this is a speedway car, and NASCAR has a pretty tight box they put us in for rear spring location and rear spring angles. Case and Bird will be under the car double checking that stuff, and if something isn't up to snuff, it's not uncommon to have to cut the lower spring perch loose from the truck arm, get your angles and location right, and then weld the perch back down. You know what? Before we get too deep in the weeds with pulling the car down, let me just introduce you to the JDM guys. First of all, this is Case Kallenbach, the crew chief on the 6 car. He was also the crew chief I worked with my last couple of seasons at JDM in 2021 and 2022. I was kind of a floater at the shop. I helped out with whatever car might need it, but on race days I sat on the box next to Case. Next up is Alex Bird, the car chief on the 6 car. He's a bit on the shorter and slimmer side and kind of wiry too. He's able to climb inside the car and work on whatever, and I really kind of hate him for that. It's been a few thousand cheeseburgers since I've been able to fit inside the car comfortably. Bert also brings his little wiener dog Murphy to the shop on occasion, and I love the doggies, and putty tats too for that matter, and I've got treats in my desk drawer in case Murphy shows up on either of the days I'm at the shop. It sickens me to have to do this, but this is Robert Dorman, the tire guy on the 6 car. I recently did a couple of posts about the Tire Guy Mafia on Facebook. It's a shady organization that NASCAR refuses to admit even exists. Each team, and I'm talking Cup, Xfinity, Truck, and even ARCA, has a representative in the Tire Guy Mafia. The teams call them tire specialists. I'm trying to keep this video PG, so I can't tell you what I call these guys. Anyways, Dorfman, that's what I call old Robert here, is the guy who controls all things tires on the 6 car. This is Dylan Roberts. He's the tire guy on the 4 car. I haven't really gotten to know Dylan all that well yet, but I imagine when he finally runs amok and appears on the local news, the story's going to start out. He was a quiet fellow who seemingly never caused any trouble and kept to himself. And finally, there's Ryan Hatch. He's a mechanic. He's a nice enough guy and has a good sense of humor. He's half Hatch Squatch and half Fozzie Bear. His hobbies include iRacing, and his pet peeves are pretty much anything I say to him. I'm going to quick squeeze this in here. It's actually May 6, 2024 in the real world, and this weekend's race is in Darlington. When I got to the shop this morning, Case had the number 6 car up on the pull-down and had just finished hooking up all the attachment rods. So I decided to take a couple of pictures real quick. In the first one you can see both Petree rigs in the picture, the closest one empty, and the 6's car is on the one in the rear. In the second, you can get a much clearer picture of all those rods. You can see that longitudinal diagonal bar that runs from the front to the rear and keeps the car from rolling off the scale pads. You can see the transverse diagonal rods that keep the car from shifting side to side, as we do the tests. And you can see the vertical links that tie the car to the plate when we're moving the scale pads up and down in those tests as well. Okay, now we'll take a look at what the Petree Rig's software calls the big picture. The plate heights are all at 0, and the weights and percentages still look right. You want to just take the slop out of the heims on those upright links. If you've tightened one down too much, you'll see it reflected in the pad weights and your wedge percentage. But everything looks good to go, so now let's remove those strut rods that replace the front shocks. We've got what's called the shock board, which is about a 1/2 inch thick piece of aluminum, and it's got adjustable posts on it. You loosen those posts and move them to fit the length of the 2 strut rods. Then Case will measure those lengths, and they are recorded in the spreadsheet for this race's tests. Now this is where things get different than they did back in the mid to late 2000s. Nowadays we control how far down the front suspension travels with a bump spring, spacers, and removable packers that are located on the front shock absorber. But back in the day, we were using what was called a coil bind setup. What this means is that you used a soft front spring and would let the front suspension travel until there were no longer any gaps between the coils on the spring. The spring would compress no further, and that's what controlled how far down the front of the car could travel. But getting that amount of spring compression right before it coil bound was the kicker. Pretty much everyone was using Renton springs for this. Renton is a spring company in the state of Washington that, let me put it this way, if you need a high quality spring, they supply everything from, the aviation industry, the space program, our defense contractors, motorsports. If you're needing a high quality spring, they're the folks to go to. Anyways, these springs are high dollar items, and you would need several springs with the same spring rate but slightly different travel to coil bind to get everything right. Let's say you had a 330 pound spring that traveled X amount before it coil bound. You were probably going to have one of the same rate that traveled X plus another eighth or so, plus one that traveled X minus an eighth or so. Or even probably a couple more that traveled just a bit more or less than that. It got pretty expensive. Nowadays, although you'll have a selection of front shock bump springs of various rates from, say, 3,000 pounds on up to 10 or 11 or even 12,000 pounds. By the way, Renton, as well as other companies like Ibach, make these bump springs. You use relatively inexpensive aluminum packers to actually control your travel. If you look at the picture I've had up, you can see the shock with its bump springs, spacers, and packers in the foreground, and behind it, the front spring located on the lower control arm and with an adjustable upper spring perch. While Case is building up a set of test shocks, we'll have our tire guy, Dorfman, set the tire pressures to the race pressures, and then we'll run our camber tests. We run the tests in the same sequence each week. We do front cambers first, then our loads tests, and then Bumpsteer. And then finally we'll run a rear spring test too. We know what pad height we want to run our test to in order to get that front splitter just a whisker off the track. Case and Bird have already set the static cambers when they set the car up, and tire data tells us what we want for dynamic camber at our anticipated loads. If that dynamic camber is off, we'll add or subtract camber shims until we get it right, and then we'll also record the new static cambers. Case is finished building a set of dummy shocks for the fronts. If you look at this picture, you can see that he's installed a bump spring with the desired spring rate for this race. Aluminum spacers and packer shims of various thicknesses until the air gap at the installed shock length is where we're going to want to start the test. If we've run this chassis at a track previously, we'll start at the gaps from that pull-down test. We'll take a look at where we ended that race for gaps and probably start there. Notice that the packers come in different colors. Each thickness has its own color. That means that during practice or a race, Case can simply tell the front changer to pull a blue packer instead of, hey, pull an 1/8 inch packer out of the left front. There's less likelihood of a mistake. Note those tethers attached to the packers. That makes it quick and easy to pull one during a race. So now Bird installs the front pull-down shocks, and then Case will hook up the front bar. As I've said, we know what we want the wheel travels to be in order to just keep that splitter from digging taters on the track. So now it's a matter of adding or subtracting packers until we hit the max loads we think we'll see at those heights. How do we know what those loads are? Well, since NASCAR banned testing, it's been pretty much done with simulations. That or previous data you might have had when we still could test. If you don't have access to a simulation, sometimes you have to get creative. I've got a story about that deserves a video of its own down the road. I'm going to show a loads test on Clemens's Mittler rig. Here's one of the advantages of the Mittler too. You can either run the loads test by running the pads up, like on the Petree Rig, or you can pull the car down to the rig. That way you can visually see or measure the splitter heights off the ground at load. On the Petree Rig, we pulled string lines initially. I later wrote a spreadsheet that took the left front, and right rear pad heights and figured out the Cartesian equation of a plane, and then you could extend the plane forward and figure your splitter heights from that. We did pull string lines to verify our numbers, and the math checked, so we can double check our splitter heights that way now. The final front test will be Bumpsteer. Back in the day, we'd put the car up on jack stands, remove the front spring, and use an old-fashioned bump gauge. Here's a couple of pictures of a Bumpsteer gauge I built out of scrap. You'd start with the spindle shaft at ride height, zero the two gauges, jack the lower control arm up 1 inch, look at the gauges, do the math to see whether it was towing in or out, and record that number. Then you jack the lower up another inch, and repeat, etc., etc. Most amateur racers still do their Bumpsteer using a gauge like this. There's a downside to doing it this way though. You don't see what the chassis deflection under load is actually doing to your bump. Here's a graph of one of our cars that shows Bumpsteer without the shocks hooked up, overlaid by Bumpsteer with the shocks hooked up. You can see exactly when the bump spring engages on either side of the car, and how the Bumpsteer changes when that bump spring is engaged. Obviously it changes dramatically, and doing it the old-fashioned way can give you a false read. You ideally want your Bumpsteer to be 0, and you'll change the bump slugs on the drag link or stack shims under the steering arm slug until you can get as close to 0 as you can. Here's a Bumpsteer test being run on the Petree Rig. It's ever so much easier and more accurate this way. Instead of gauges, the rig uses a couple of linear potentiometers, and the software does the math and provides you with a graph. Can't get much sexier than that. The last test we'll run will be a rear loads test, and this is especially important on a speedway car. We'll keep clocking the springs on the lower perches until we find the sweet spot that gives us the lowest wheel rate. And definitely remember how those springs are clocked for when we're going through tech. A lower wheel rate should give you greater rear travel for a given load, and that's of the utmost importance when you're qualifying on a speedway. If you graph the wheel load versus the travel, the slope of that line is going to give you your wheel rate. And with that, our pull down test is done. We'll get the car off the rig and finish up anything that's left on our checklists, and that'll be it for Tuesday. While we're watching Mark Setzer slowly let his race car down off the Mittler rig, I'd like to thank you if you've hung all the way to the end of this video. A lot of the nuts and bolts of getting the car actually ready to go to the track can seem pretty monotonous, but any success you might have depends on doing your due diligence and checking off all those boxes. If you've enjoyed this video, and even if you haven't, please like it and subscribe to my channel. The next video in this series is going to be about Wednesday and getting the car on the dyno. I hope to see you there. Catch you on the flip side.